I knew the HOA was gunning for me the second they saw me repaint my barn a deep forest green. Not neon, not flashy, just a respectable, earthy green. But apparently, it violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood, according to Wilma Dorsey, the queen bee of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Wilma was the kind of woman who wore tennis skirts despite never playing tennis, carried a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm, and treated the HOA bylaws like scripture. She'd already tried to fine me for having a non-regulation mailbox. And then for leaving my trash bins out too long, 2 hours past pickup. But this time, she crossed a line. I was in my driveway rewiring the motion lights on my garage when she strutted up with 2 other HOA drones trailing behind her. "Victor Talley, that barn is an eyesore," Wilma announced, pointing at the freshly painted structure like it had personally offended her ancestors. "We gave you a cease and desist letter. You ignored it." I wiped my hands on a rag. "Because you have zero authority to dictate the color of my barn. It's on the back of my acreage. No one sees it unless they're trespassing." Wilma leaned in like she was about to deliver a sermon. "You think you're clever because you know the bylaws better than most, Victor, but you're still part of this community. And if you won't comply with our rules, we'll escalate it." "Try me," I said, already turning back to my wiring. I didn't think she'd actually push it further. But she did. 3 days later, 2 men in badly fitting uniforms and knockoff aviators showed up at my front door. "Sir, we're with the Willow Creek Community Enforcement Division," one said, holding up what looked like a laminated ID card printed on a home printer. I stared at them. "That's not a real department." The other guy, who had a gut too big for his belt, stepped forward. "We've received multiple complaints about code violations. We need to inspect the premises." "You're not cops, you're trespassing." "We're authorized by the HOA," I laughed. "That's not how the law works." I could see Wilma standing across the street, arms crossed, watching everything unfold like she was directing a stage play. "All right," I said, stepping aside. "You want to see the barn, let's go." They followed me around the side of the house, boots crunching over gravel, puffed up with fake authority. The barn sat about 50 yards back. As we approached, the taller one reached for a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. It was a kid's toy. Literally. Bright orange plastic. I opened the barn door wide. "After you." They stepped inside, and that's when the real cops swarmed them. 4 deputies from the county sheriff's office, who'd been crouched behind hay bales and the old tractor, burst out with real weapons, real badges, and very real handcuffs. "Hands where we can see them." The fake cops froze like mannequins. I crossed my arms and looked at Wilma, who was now sprinting down the sidewalk, trying to disappear behind a hedge. One of the deputies looked over at me. "You were right on the money, Victor, impersonating law enforcement." "That's a felony," I nodded. "Told you my barn was good for something." By the time the fake officers were being loaded into cruisers, the neighborhood had turned into a quiet amphitheater of half-drawn curtains and subtle gawking. No one said a word, but I could feel the ripple of change starting. The fear Wilma had built like a fortress was showing cracks. Deputy Leland, who led the sting, handed me a copy of the incident report. "We'll be forwarding this to the DA. You were right to tip us off. Fake badges, fake IDs, trespassing, impersonating peace officers." "That's serious time," I nodded. "They said they were authorized by the HOA." His eyes narrowed. "We'll be speaking to the HOA president very soon." I didn't need to say anything. We both knew exactly who that was. The next morning, I drove into town and parked outside the county clerk's office. I wasn't just going to let Wilma slither out of this with a polite warning. I'd spent the past few weeks reviewing HOA filings and public meeting transcripts. There were patterns, strange ones. Fines issued to new residents who happened to question Wilma's decisions. Increased dues voted in during emergency meetings that never had proper notice. And now, fake authority figures sent to intimidate a homeowner. Inside, I met with Judith Kaplan, assistant to the county records supervisor. She had a reputation for being meticulous, and a bit of a bulldog when it came to public documents. "I need access to Willow Creek HOA's financial filings," I said, sliding over the request form I'd filled out in advance. Judith adjusted her glasses and gave me a long look. Someone finally poking the beast, more like shining a light on it. She gave a slow nod and disappeared into the back room. 10 minutes later, she returned with a stack of folders and a USB drive. "Someone tried to accidentally misfile half of these under another subdivision," she said, tapping the folders. "Didn't work." I spent the next 4 hours in the public research room, cross-referencing expense reports, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Nearly $20,000 paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist, supposedly for decorative berm repair. A security system upgrade invoice that listed triple the market cost, billed to a tech firm owned by Wilma's nephew. Then there was a series of legal retainers paid to a firm that had dissolved 2 years earlier. I took photos of everything with my phone, time-stamped and geo-tagged for evidence. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew someone who was. Clara Renwick, a retired criminal defense attorney, lived 3 houses down. She'd been quiet during HOA meetings, rarely spoke during community events, but she had a sharp eye and an even sharper memory. I found her in her front yard pruning her rose bushes. "I've been expecting you, Victor," she said without looking up. "You heard what happened? I saw it, and I've been waiting for someone else to get fed up." I showed her the photos. She led me inside without a word, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and opened her laptop. "These contracts," she said, scrolling through the images, "they're not just fraudulent. Some of these carry felony weight, especially if dues were misappropriated. I want to go public, not just police. I want the neighborhood to see it all," she nodded. "Then we do it right. No leaks, no rumors. We compile everything into a formal complaint with the state attorney's office. And while we're at it, we'll notify the Department of Consumer Affairs. HOAs fall under their jurisdiction for abuse of governance." Over the next week, Clara and I worked quietly. We built a case file more airtight than a submarine. Copies of checks, tax filings, and subpoena-ready testimony from 3 former HOA board members who'd mysteriously stepped down within the last year. One of them, David Rourke, admitted Wilma had forced him to sign off on fabricated expenses under threat of legal action. "She said no one would ever challenge her," David told us during a recorded statement. "She said the bylaws gave her absolute discretion. I knew it wasn't true, but I didn't want to get sued." We filed our complaint on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, a county investigator contacted Clara to confirm receipt. By Monday, the Department of Consumer Affairs opened a formal probe. But the real fireworks came at the emergency HOA meeting Wilma called the following Wednesday. The clubhouse was packed. For once, people weren't there for cookies and passive chit-chat. They were angry. The news had started to trickle out, first whispers, then texts, then a full-blown rumor storm, and everyone wanted answers. Wilma stood at the front, her usual poise cracked just slightly. Her pearls looked too tight around her neck, her voice just a little too shrill. "We've all heard some very disturbing and, frankly, slanderous accusations this week," she said. "Let me assure you, everything the board has done is within the scope of our charter and bylaws." I waited until she finished her rehearsed speech before standing. Clara sat beside me, laptop open, documents queued on the projector screen. "I have copies of every financial transaction conducted under your presidency," I said, "including payments to fake vendors, fraudulent legal retainers, and unauthorized security expenditures." Gasps rippled through the room. Wilma's jaw tightened. "You don't have the authority to." "I do," I interrupted. "And so does the state attorney's office, who received this evidence 3 days ago, along with sworn statements from former board members and a notarized copy of the original HOA charter, one you altered without community approval." Clara clicked the remote, and the screen lit up with the first document. A check for $6,000 made out to Garden Elite Services, a company that didn't appear in any business registry. Wilma's composure cracked. "This is a coordinated smear. Then explain why 2 men impersonating officers showed up at my house claiming to act on your behalf," I said. "They're in custody now and they talked. They said you paid them to enforce compliance. That's not a smear." "That's conspiracy." People began shouting, questions, accusations, demands. "I move for a vote of no confidence," Clara said calmly. "I second it," someone else called out. Within minutes, the board was replaced by interim members, including Clara and myself. Wilma tried to object, but by then the county investigator had arrived with a subpoena in hand. "You're Wilma Dorsey?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, trembling. "You'll need to come with me." No one clapped, no one cheered. It was dead silent as she followed him out the door. After the meeting, neighbors approached me, many who'd never spoken more than a word or two before. They offered support, apologies, even baked goods. But more than anything, they asked the same thing. "How did you know where to start?" I told them the truth. When someone sends fake cops to your property, they've already shown you what kind of game they're playing. You just have to be willing to outplay them. And this time we had 3 weeks past, and the neighborhood was still buzzing, though now the mood had shifted. Instead of fear, there was curiosity. People who had once kept their heads down now lingered outside with their coffee mugs, waving to neighbors they'd barely acknowledged before. The HOA's iron grip had been shattered, but I knew better than to think the mess was over. Wilma had posted bail, of course. Her husband, a semi-retired real estate broker with more money than morals, had footed it quietly, but she wasn't back at her house. Rumor was she'd holed up in a gated community 2 towns over, staying with a cousin until her court date. Clara and I didn't speculate. We were too busy combing through the digital remains of her reign. Turns out the rabbit hole went deeper. I was at Clara's kitchen table, flipping through a USB drive she'd pulled from one of the seized HOA laptops, when something caught my eye. A folder labeled "Hold Harmless Docs." Inside were scanned letters, dozens all signed by homeowners, most dated within the last 2 years. They were waivers, absolving the HOA of liability for security operations and compliance interventions. But one thing stood out. The signatures didn't match the names. I leaned back in the chair. "These are forged." Clara didn't look surprised. "How can you tell?" "The handwriting is identical across 6 different letters. And this one," I said, pointing at a waiver supposedly signed by a woman named Tessa Monroe, "has a date from 2 months after she moved out of the neighborhood." Clara reached for her phone without saying a word. She called a contact at the district attorney's office and spoke in short, crisp phrases. By the time she hung up, her expression had tightened. "They're opening a second investigation," she said. "Forgery, document tampering, and civil rights violations. Multiple homeowners may have been tricked into thinking they agreed to surveillance and enforcement." That night, I walked the perimeter of my property with a flashlight, not out of paranoia, just to be sure. I'd installed a few discreet cameras after the fake cops incident, and I didn't want to be caught off guard again. As I passed the edge of the tree line near the back, I spotted something odd. A trail of disturbed leaves led from the cul-de-sac path behind my lot to a spot near the fence. I crouched down and found fresh boot prints too clean to be from a neighbor walking their dog. Someone had been watching. From the outside, I called Clara and met her at the community center the next morning, where we were now holding open neighborhood meetings twice a week. Attendance had doubled since Wilma's removal, and people were eager to stay informed. As I walked in, I noticed 2 new faces, one man in his early 30s with a notepad, and a woman with a badge clipped to her belt. "Victor Talley?" she asked, stepping forward. "That's me. I'm Agent Rojas with the State Bureau of Investigation. This is my partner, Agent Kim. We've been assigned to the Willow Creek HOA case." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think it had escalated to state level yet." "It has now," Rojas replied. Between the forged documents and the impersonation charges, This is no longer just a county matter. We're looking at organized fraud under color of law. Agent Kim opened his folder. We've learned that the men who posed as enforcement officers were hired through a shell company registered in Nevada. That company received funds from an account tied to Willow Creek's operating budget. How much? I asked. Just under $24,000, said Kim. Transferred in chunks to avoid detection. Clara didn't flinch. And let me guess, no board vote approving those transfers. None that we could find. Agent Rojas looked around the room. We're going to need full access to HOA archives, communications, and vendor contracts going back 5 years. Can you help us with that? You'll have everything by this afternoon, Clara said. The agents gave us a direct line to a secure portal where we could upload documents. As they left, Rojas handed me her card. If anyone contacts you, threatens, bribes, anything, call me directly. We believe Wilma may have had accomplices on other HOA boards in the region. This isn't isolated. Hours later, Clara and I sat in the old board office, now under lock and key. We went through files with gloves, photographing everything before scanning and uploading it. That's when we found the burner phone. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out legal book on shelf 3. Clara opened the back and found a micro SD card taped inside. We popped it into her laptop. It contained audio recordings. The first was a conversation between Wilma and a man with a gravelly voice. They don't need to know what's really going on, just tell them it's protocol. Nobody reads the fine print anyway. What about the guy with the barn, Talley? His type always folds when you show force. Send someone to knock on the door. Make it look official. There were more. Dozens. Plots discussed in cold, calculated tones. Plans to install cameras on private property lines and blame it on community safety initiatives. Strategies for inflating fines to push out lower-income residents. Clara sat back, face pale. They weren't just overreaching. They were purging. We uploaded every file, every recording, every contract. By nightfall, the SBI had issued subpoenas for 3 more individuals, former board members who had quietly moved out in the last 6 months. One of them had been on the Architectural Review Committee for over a decade. The next community meeting was standing room only. People were livid. A man named Gerard, who'd had a lien placed on his house last year over an unpaid fine for decorative lighting violations, stood up and demanded to know who had reviewed the fine. Turns out, no one had. The fine had come from a forged document, same signature style as the waivers. I nearly lost my home over this, Gerard said, voice shaking. I thought I was alone. I thought I'd messed up. You weren't, Clara told him. They wanted you to think that, but you weren't. The room erupted in applause, not out of celebration, but solidarity. The next week, the SBI began interviewing residents. Clara and I handed over control of the digital archive to the state. The burner phone recordings were authenticated, and a grand jury was convened. Charges began stacking up against Wilma and her co-conspirators: wire fraud, conspiracy to intimidate, civil rights violations, and criminal impersonation. But the most shocking charge came from an unexpected direction. Agent Rojas called me one morning with a tone I hadn't heard from her before, something between disbelief and fury. We traced the shell company Wilma used to an address in Reno. It's a warehouse registered under a different name, but inside we found multiple uniforms, fake IDs, and surveillance equipment. Turns out, it was part of a broader operation, a network of community enforcement setups masquerading as private security. You're saying this wasn't just about our neighborhood? It's part of a commercial scam that's been running in at least 7 communities across 3 states. Wilma was one of the organizers. They created fake problems, then billed real money to fix them through fear, coercion, and fraud. The state issued a public statement, and news vans started showing up at the gates of Willow Creek. Clara and I declined interviews. We weren't interested in fame. We were interested in fixing what had been broken. The interim board voted to dissolve the HOA's enforcement committee entirely. New bylaws were drafted with community oversight. Any fines required a public notice and a vote. Surveillance equipment was removed from all common areas unless approved by a 2/3 majority. And the barn, it stayed green. It became a symbol of what happens when people refuse to be bullied. A place where fake power collapsed in the face of real unity. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Clara and I sat on the porch of my house with a jug of lemonade between us. "You think they'll try something like this again?" I asked. "Someone always does," she said. "But next time they'll know we're watching. And more importantly, they'd know the barn wasn't just a building. It was a line they'd never cross again." The first court date arrived under a slate-gray sky, the kind that made everything feel heavier. I parked 2 blocks from the county courthouse and walked the rest of the way past reporters lining the sidewalk, their cameras angled toward the front doors like vultures watching a carcass breathe its last. Clara was already inside, seated near the front with her notes meticulously indexed in a red leather binder. Wilma wasn't in the courtroom yet. But her attorney, a lean man in a tailored navy suit with a jaw so clenched it could cut glass, was already settling in at the defense table. His briefcase had gold initials embossed on the side, clearly a man used to being paid well to clean up messes. I took my seat behind the prosecution's table, not as a witness yet, but as someone the DA had called a key originator of discovery. The assistant district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Margot Chiu, gave me a subtle nod. When Wilma finally entered, she looked diminished. Her outfit, once crisp and commanding, hung on her like it had been borrowed. No pearls, no clipboard, just a woman walking into a courtroom where her name was now tied to felony charges. The charges were read aloud one by one, and each one seemed to weigh heavier than the last. Conspiracy to commit fraud, impersonating a public official through agents, forgery, embezzlement, and coercion under the color of authority. Her plea, not guilty. No surprise there. Clara leaned toward me and whispered, "She's betting on a technicality. People like her always do." Over the next several days, the case unfolded in layers. The prosecutors presented records from bank accounts Wilma had used to funnel HOA funds into shell companies. Each transfer was time-stamped, each invoice traced back to a P.O. box registered under a pseudonym. But the real turning point came when they played the audio files from the burner phone. The jury listened in silence as Wilma's voice echoed through the courtroom. "If you make the problem loud enough, you get to sell the solution. That's how you move people." The last recording ended with a chilling phrase, "No one checks credentials. They just see a badge and obey." There was no applause, no gasps, just a stillness so complete you could hear the fluorescent lighting hum. The defense tried to pivot, arguing that the board had acted in good faith, that Wilma had been misled by third-party contractors. But when Agent Rojas took the stand and laid out the interstate scope of the scheme, including coordinated enforcement tactics across 3 separate states, it was over. The jury saw it for what it was. A calculated system of intimidation designed to drain money and power from anyone too timid or too isolated to fight back. I was called to testify on the 5th day. I described the night the fake officers came to my property, how their badges had no issuing authority, how they tried to enter without a warrant, and how they claimed to be acting on HOA orders. I recounted bringing the real deputies into the barn and watching them take down the imposters. Every word I said had been backed by video, documentation, and corroborated statements from law enforcement. After court adjourned that day, I stepped outside and found Agent Rojas waiting on the steps. "You did more than expose a scam," she said. "You peeled back a blueprint that's been used in at least a dozen other neighborhoods. We've already arrested 2 more people who ran similar operations in Arizona and Oregon." I asked what would happen to Wilma after the trial. "If she's convicted on all counts," Rojas said, "she's looking at 20 years. Minimum." Back in Willow Creek, the neighborhood had begun transforming in ways no one expected. Without the HOA's constant surveillance, residents began to reclaim their spaces not recklessly, but freely. Lawns grew a little more wild, but friendlier. Kids played soccer in front yards without receiving citations for unauthorized public gatherings. People started talking to each other more, organizing volunteer cleanup days and weekend markets in the park. Clara suggested we turn the now vacant HOA clubhouse into a shared community center. We held a vote, an actual vote, transparent and documented, and it passed with overwhelming support. A few of us spent weekends repainting the interior, removing the dusty file cabinets, and replacing them with bookshelves, puzzles, and a bulletin board where people could pin up announcements about lost pets, garage sales, or local events. One evening, as I was finishing repairs on the door frame, a man I didn't recognize approached me. He was in his late 50s, wore a denim vest over a faded concert tee, and had the kind of sun-worn face that told stories without needing words. "You're the guy with the barn," he said. "I am," he nodded. "I used to live in a neighborhood in Nevada. Same thing happened there. HOA got too big for its britches. They ran me out after I refused to tear down a shed I built for my disabled son." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. "Seeing what you did here," he continued, "it gave me something I didn't think I'd find again. Closure." He handed me a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of his old neighborhood with annotations. "Might be worth looking into. If they haven't been caught yet, maybe you can help someone else do what you did." I took the paper. "Thank you." He left without another word. Weeks later, Wilma was convicted on all charges. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for merciless sentencing in fraud cases, didn't hold back. "The abuse of authority under a veil of community service is especially egregious," she said, her voice level. "You not only defrauded your neighbors, you used fear as a tool to maintain power. This court sentences you to 18 years in state prison with no possibility of parole before 12. Wilma didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She simply stared ahead as if the world had already left her behind. After the verdict was read, Clara and I stood outside the courthouse together. She pulled a small silver key from her pocket and held it out to me. "Took this from the old HOA safe," she said. "Figured it ought to belong to the person who burned down their empire without lighting a single match." I took it and turned it over in my hand. "What is it for?" "No idea," she said, "but I figured if anyone could find out, it'd be you." Later that night, I walked out to the barn. The green paint had faded slightly under the sun, but it still stood tall against the horizon, its silhouette familiar and solid. I slid the key into an old lock embedded in the foundation stone, a lock I'd never bothered to investigate before, and to my surprise, it turned. Inside the hidden compartment was a lockbox. It held old HOA records, ones that predated even Wilma's tenure. Letters from residents going back 15 years, some warning of irregularities, others pleading for help. Most had gone unanswered. I understood then that Wilma hadn't built the rot. She'd inherited it and made it worse. The next morning, I brought the box to the community center and set it on a table. Anyone who wanted to see it could, no secrets, no locked doors, just people finally allowed to know the truth about where they lived. That's how Willow Creek changed, not with a fight, but with a refusal to be silent. We didn't just remove a tyrant. We dismantled the system that allowed her to rise, and the barn, it didn't just mark where it all started. It stood as a reminder that when someone tries to intimidate a community into silence, there's power in standing tall, even if you're the only one. Because sooner or later, others will stand with you.